Jerusalem wasn't simply a city. It was the last flame burning in a dark region. Around it, entire empires had fallen to an unstoppable force, Assyria. No one had stopped them. No walls, no alliances, no faith. Assyria didn't conquer. Assyria devoured. And now that beast was heading for the spiritual heart of a people who clung to their God while the world fell apart. King Hezekiah, barely 39 years old, had attempted the impossible. He had purged idols, restored the temple, broken alliances with Egypt. He had rebelled against the Assyrian yoke in the hope that Yahweh would defend him. But the answer came not in the form of a miracle, but in the form of war. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, a tyrant with dried blood on his hands, marched with his most brutal army, 185,000 soldiers, hardened by massacres, experts in torture, beasts trained to destroy from within. It wasn't just a military invasion. It was a psychological war. Assyria didn't want to win. It wanted to break Judah's soul. The neighboring cities were razed one by one. Lachish, the jewel of the south, fell within days. Assyrian chronicles carved in stone show prisoners impaled, heads piled up as a warning, children torn from their mothers' arms. It was a spectacle designed to sow terror before reaching Jerusalem. When the Assyrian army finally encamped before the walls of the holy city, they did so with brutal arrogance. They pitched their tents as if they would stay forever. They lit fires. They raised black banners, and then they spoke. The Assyrian emissary, Rabshakeh, didn't use diplomacy. He spoke in Hebrew. He shouted from the walls so that all the citizens could hear him. Mockery, blasphemy, threats. He promised them hunger, thirst, and slow death. In whom do you trust? Has this God of yours saved any nation? Where are the gods of Hamath, of Arpad? They have all fallen. And you think your Yahweh will do anything? The impact was devastating. Within Jerusalem, fear spread like a plague. The priests fell silent. The warriors trembled. The people bowed their heads. There was no army. There was no way out. Only one certainty: the next day could be the last. Hezekiah, far from raising weapons, tore his clothes. He went up to the temple. He threw himself to the ground. Not like a king, but like a broken man. Silently, he demanded an answer, a sign, something. And then Isaiah appeared. The prophet did not carry a sword, but his gaze burned. Thus says Yahweh, do not fear. Sennacherib will not enter this city. He will not shoot an arrow. He will turn back the way he came. And this city will be defended, not by men, but by fire from heaven. The world's most feared army was at the gates, and the only hope was the word of a prophet. The air that night was charged with something different, as if the heavens were holding their breath. The war hadn't even begun yet. But in the darkness, something was already moving. The fires of the Assyrian camp illuminated faces hardened by war. There was laughter, meat roasting on the embers, betting. They were not afraid. Who would fear an invisible god when one has slaughtered empires? The Assyrian generals were toasting. They had already drafted the victory letters they would send to Nineveh. Jerusalem was just a formality. But that night, the silence came too quickly. The stars seemed to tremble. The wind, for an instant, stopped. Then a murmur arose from nowhere. It wasn't a human sound. It was an echo, a hum, a vibration that seemed to come from the air itself. Something ancient. Something that had no name. And then it appeared. It didn't descend like a dove. It wasn't a divine whisper. It was a soundless burst. A presence that distorted reality in its wake. No one saw it coming, because it had no fixed form. It was fire and shadow, wind and flesh, everything and nothing. He was an angel, but not the one on the postcards. The scriptures don't describe his wings, but they do describe his fury. A single touch from him was death. A sigh and the heart stopped beating. He passed between the tents slowly, without pause. No one screamed. No one struggled. They simply stopped breathing. A soldier sat up in the night, sweat on his forehead. He had felt something. He peered out of his tent and found the sentry motionless. He thought he was sleeping. He approached to push him, but his body fell like a stone. No wound, no blood, dead. Eyes open, mouth frozen in a grimace of terror. He ran to alert others, but found more bodies. 1, 10, 100. All dead, all with the same expression. And then he understood. Death didn't come with swords. It came with silence. By the time the rest awoke, it was late. The air was thick, as if something invisible had contaminated it. Some tried to flee. Others couldn't even stand up. It was a formless plague. It was judgment. 85,000 soldiers trained to kill couldn't lift a spear. There was no combat. No blood was shed in battle. There was extermination. From within, from the invisible, from the divine. In Jerusalem, the night seemed eternal. But in the temple, Isaiah slept in peace. Hezekiah prayed in silence, and the people held their breath. Until the sun began to rise over the horizon, the world's most feared army was at the gates, and the only hope was the word of a prophet. The air that night was charged with something different, as if the heavens were holding their breath. The war hadn't even begun yet. But in the darkness, something was already moving. The first ray of sunlight brought no hope. It brought silence. A silence thicker than death itself. The sentries of Jerusalem looked down from the top of the walls. They expected to see movement, formations, drums, banners, but everything remained still. Too still. One of them squinted. He noticed something. The Assyrian banners were still up, but they didn't move, as if no one was holding them. The wind blew, but the cloths didn't flutter. They were shadows pinned to the ground. Another guard raised a horn. No one answered. They sent out scouts cautiously. They passed through the gates, walked on the ground that still held the echo of threats, and what they found was impossible. A sea of bodies, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, all fallen, all motionless. There was no blood. There were no weapons on the ground. There were no signs of a struggle. Only open eyes staring up at the sky, some with their mouths frozen in a scream that never came out. Others clutched their spears like children clutching toys before going to sleep. The stench had not yet reached them, but death was present, clinging to their skin, to their throats, to their souls. When the message reached the temple, Hezekiah knelt. He didn't say a word. He just looked up at the sky, his eyes filling with tears. They weren't of pride. They were of awe, of terror, of reverence, because he understood that he hadn't won a war. He had survived a heavenly intervention. On the outskirts of the camp, the few survivors trembled. Some couldn't speak. Others babbled nonsense. They had seen something. Some said they had seen fire. Others, a figure between the tents. Still others felt only the air thicken. And then nothing. Sennacherib, the great conqueror, fled. He gave no explanations. He wrote no proclamations. He simply retreated to Nineveh, where, according to later chronicles, he was murdered by his own sons. The man who defied the God of Israel ended up stabbed in his own blood. In Jerusalem, the story became legend. But not everyone celebrated, because they knew it wasn't a victory. It was a warning, a demonstration. That divine justice doesn't always fall like rain. Sometimes it falls like formless fire. The city came back to life. The gates opened. The people came out. They cried. They laughed. They hugged. But something had changed. Because those who saw the Assyrian camp knew that Yahweh wasn't just a God of love. He was also a God who responded. A God who, when he decides to act, does so without warning. And that night the angel was never seen again. But his shadow remained etched in the memory of a people who understood that faith doesn't always require armies. Sometimes all it takes is a single divine command to rewrite the whole of history. What happened that night was documented in the sacred scrolls, but it was also feared, because there were questions no one wanted to answer. What kind of being is capable of annihilating 185,000 men without touching a single one? What dimension does that angel inhabit? And why hasn't he done it again? Some rabbis claim it wasn't just any angel. It was the angel of final judgment, the same one who appears in the Exodus, the one who killed the firstborn in Egypt, the one who has the power to take life with a word. Others claim it wasn't an angel at all, but Yahweh himself manifested. In the oldest codices, there are erased lines, passages that suggest the event was so terrifying that many in Jerusalem lost their faith or went mad. There are hidden legends that claim Isaiah was never the same again, that from that day on he spoke to the void, and that every time he slept, he saw fire. In 1830, British archaeologists found a series of Assyrian tablets that mention Sennacherib's retreat but don't explain why. One simply states, the body showed no wounds, but neither did they breathe. Another mentions that the king's priests advised never to approach the land of Judah again. What did Sennacherib see that night? What did that angel whisper to him? Why did the most feared emperor on the planet flee without shedding a single drop of blood? Throughout the centuries, artists, theologians, and occultists have attempted to depict the scene, but none have managed to capture the terror contained in that dawn. Because it's not about seeing a dead body, it's about understanding that an entire war machine was halted by the invisible. And perhaps that is the most chilling message. It wasn't visible power that won. It was the power that cannot be touched, measured, or stopped. A power that follows no human laws, who doesn't respond to empty pleas, who appears only when he chooses. And when he does, he rewrites history without asking permission. Today, the valley where the Assyrians camped lies in ruins. Nothing grows. The locals say the earth still holds the echo of that whisper, that at night the wind changes direction. And sometimes, if you are in absolute silence, you can hear it pass by and no one dares to sleep there.